Chicago. My father is in town about once a year, and so when he's in town, we try to go and we take our children, and he gets to see the grandkids and all that kind of fun stuff. So we spent the week in Chicago. And last week, I was here for the very early part of it, and then you saw that Pastor Joshua, he was here to give the message because we did a pulpit exchange. So I went to his church and I preached, and he came to our church and he preached. I got a chance to see the recorded video of the sermon that he gave, and I'm sure as I was blessed that you all were blessed. And actually, so after that, on Friday and Saturday, I was in Richmond speaking at a Chinese Baptist church in Richmond for a development Bible we're having up there. And just came up last night about midnight, and I'm able to join all of us this morning. Something about coming back home, LCF feels like home to me, and the longer I'm away, the more I want to come back, and it's great to see everyone's faces, and it's good to be back. It's hard to believe this is the last week of March, and I feel like I'm saying that every time. It's the last week of January, the last week of February, and it's the last week of March, but it's just ridiculous. It's already the end of March, and I'm already drugged up because I'm taking all these medications for allergies because it's pollen season and pollen kills me. And I have to take eye drops because my eyes are always burning. I have to take a nasal spray because I can't breathe and it's not like I'm underwater. And then on top of all that, I have to take Claritin because if I don't do that, then I have headaches. I get nauseous. All these things. It's not a fun season for me. And so if you're struggling with allergies too, then I pray for you, and I pity you, and I sympathize with what you're going through. It is already 2 weeks before Good Friday, meaning that after this week, we have one more week of Lent, and then we're going to be entering into our time of Holy Week, and then our time of Easter. So this morning, as we gather together and continue in our study of Philippians, I want to look at a very important passage because I think it points us towards what's happening on Easter. It's going to point us towards Christ. This section that we read today at the end of chapter 2, verse 19 through 30, is interesting because this whole 11 verses or so that Paul is talking about in this section, he's actually, all he's doing is he's just giving thanks. He's thanking certain people, and in particular he's thanking two people. He's thanking Timothy and a man named Epaphroditus. Okay? And basically all he's saying is that he's acknowledging their service to the gospel, so meaning to the work of God. He's also saying, hey, not only are they faithful servants, they're just great people. Okay? They're doing all these things that serve me, that serve Christ, that serve the church, serve the betterment of the gospel, and they're just great people. And he spends the next verses in this letter talking to the church of Philippians, and he's saying, guys, honor people like this, praise people like this, appreciate people like this, give thanks to people like this. And there's a very important message here for us because I think what God is calling us is to be able to understand what it means to value giving thanks for one another and appreciating one another. When I was in Chicago, I was attending this church on Sunday morning, and they were doing this thing. It was a Korean church, I won't say which, but it was a Korean church, and they were doing this thing where they were recognizing certain people who have done, some special things for the church. So there was this one lady in particular, and she was new, and then she had done, all these things for the church. She is like volunteer for the Sunday school. She gave like special ice cake for that fellowship. She's doing all these nice things, and so the church wanted to recognize, this newcomer and say thank you and welcome to our family and all this stuff. And so they asked her to come up to the front. Okay, so she comes up to the front, and then somebody in the welcoming committee had this nice bouquet of flower. They're coming up to give it to her, and the entire time you should have seen her face because her facial expression looked like somebody had just died. You would think that if someone is saying, thank you for all the ways that you've been serving me, thank you for, just being so generous, thank you and welcome to our family, and they're giving you a flower, and even when she's receiving her flower, she's like this. And the pastor is going around saying, let's pray for this, person, let's pray for this sister of ours and all this stuff, and she's just thinking the whole time, it's just, for me, I'm looking at this and it's so uncomfortable, because I'm like, she just doesn't seem like she wants to be there. And the whole time, she can't even make eye contact with anybody in the congregation. She's just looking down. And every time, the pastor's talking to her, she's like, what I've noticed, though? I don't think it's just that, it's not just that woman. I think something about the Korean culture, or maybe even the Asian culture, when somebody praises you or praises me, it's almost like we feel uncomfortable about saying praise. Ever notice that? When someone is saying too many nice things about you, you just kind of feel uncomfortable. You're like, it's embarrassing. Right? Some of you are nodding, and some of you younger folks may not understand this, but in the Korean culture, whatever, in the Asian American culture, what is it about? It's about the whole and not the individual. And so when people try to highlight the individual, you get uncomfortable because the whole time you're growing up, you're taught that it's not about you, it's about everyone else. It's about your family, it's about your country, it's about who you represent as a group, and it's not about the individual. And so when we try to praise the individual, like this woman, she's just so uncomfortable. She doesn't know what to do with herself. And as soon as the prayer is over, it's just like she disappeared into saying, look at yourself. Being able to appreciate one another, to be able to say thank you, and to say I appreciate the work that you do, to value who you are, to say that I love the way that you serve, I recognize that you serve, and to be able to say those things and to receive it is actually a very important part of the church that goes overlooked. It's a part of the church family and community that goes overlooked because for many of us, it's not that big of a deal. Right? There are other things that we need to recognize. People who are martyrs, people who are giving their entire life savings, people who are just spending their entire life working for Christ. Those are the people that we need to talk about. It's not the little things. We don't need to recognize the little things. We have to recognize big things. And so this part of appreciation gets overlooked. But I want to tell you what Paul is doing right here when he's pointing out Timothy and Epaphroditus. He's not just doing it for the sake, but he's actually teaching the Philippian church, continue to do so the way that I do. Appreciate people, recognize people, love people. This is not just a recommendation that Paul has, it's actually a commandment of God to do so. When we look at Psalm 15, 1 through 5, King David says this, he records in one of these Psalms, Lord, in verse 1 and 2, or in verse 1, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? So, King David is writing a psalm and he's saying, God, who may come and live with you in your temple? Okay, he's asking. He's saying, God, what kind of a person can come and live in your presence? And this is the answer that he gives in verse 2 and onwards. The one whose walk is blameless. Okay, so who is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to their neighbor, who casts no slur to one another. So all of these things that King David is keeping as a requirement to those people who can come and live with God in his kingdom. Okay? People who are blameless, who do what is righteous, who speak the truth, they don't slander, they speak good things about one another, they don't slur, they don't do all these things. Okay? Notice what happens in verse 4 and 5. Who despises a vile person, but honor those who fear the Lord. Who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not choose to mind. Who lends their money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Whoever does these things will never be shaken. In verse 4, what King David includes as a requirement of those people who can come and live in the tent of God is who despises a vile person, but honors those who fear the Lord. In the letter that Paul writes in this section, as he talks about Epaphroditus, what does he say? Welcome him and honor people like him. Honor people who fear the Lord. Honor people who serve God. As King David writes in Psalm 15, it is not just an added bonus when we say thank you to one another. It's actually a commandment. It is a requirement in order for those people to live in the house of God, in the tent of God, with the mountain of God. It means that appreciating, saying thank you, recognizing people is not just a nice thing to do. It is a commandment of God that we must do. And so when Paul says honor people like Timothy and Epaphroditus, he's not just saying do it because they've done so much and so that you want to show gratitude and do it. He's saying do it because God commands us. You see, as a church body, being able to say, I appreciate you, I recognize the way that you serve, thank you, great, good job, all of these things is not just being etiquette, it's not just being polite, it's actually obeying the commandment. Because King David writes, and Paul writes, it is actually one of the key things, along with being blameless, having a person of integrity, doing righteousness, doing good, speaking no evil. It says appreciating one another is required. do these things, when we appreciate and honor those who fear God, meaning we say thank you, we recognize other people, we say, I recognize what you're doing and I want to just praise you for the way that you serve God. What is it good? Who is it good for? We're going to look at three people that it's good for. The first group that it's good for is good for the church. Okay? When we say good job, when we say thank you, when we say I appreciate the way that you serve, when we recognize people, it's good for the church. Most of you know that I studied psychology, and before I became a pastor, before I went into seminary, I wanted to be a psychiatrist. And most of you also know that I worked at a mental hospital. And it was the most challenging and difficult time of my entire life up until this point. I was working with teenage students, and so it was a residential ward, meaning that it wasn't like a place where people would come get treated and go home. Kids would come and live at the hospital. And it depends on when you were admitted. We had kids who were 12, 11, and until they turned 18, sometimes they would live in this hospital. They were severe disorders and whatnot. And without fail, every single time when I look at their charts for why and what sort of disorder that they have, what's going on with their backgrounds and all these things, every single one of them, okay, we had about 30 patients on our floor. Every single one of them on the comment box, it always says, lacks appreciation and love and recognition. Every single one of them. It says, lacks love, appreciation, and recognition. Meaning that one of the most fundamental things for children to be able to develop correctly is this need and this desire to be recognized, to be appreciated, to be loved. You know, it's the same way as I look at my kids, right? My son reacts better when I praise him and love him than when I am just yelling at him for the things that he's doing wrong. For those of you that have kids, maybe you'll be able to relate. Right? These guys, my son, sometimes my wife and I wonder because he can't sit still. And he's almost 3 years old, and we're wondering if it's just because he's young, he's 3, he's a boy, or whatever it is, but he just can't sit still. And we talk about all the time, because Eli is almost a year younger than my son, but he can sit still and he can color, right? And that's what my wife tells me. He can color just fine. If you put a coloring book in front of my son, he'll sit there, he'll just go like this, and he's like, I'm going to go, and then he runs away. Okay? There are times when we get so concerned, my wife and I will sit down and we'll actually get angry when he does that. We'll say, Matthias, what are you doing? No, you can't do this. Like, that's not right. You have to color within those lines. You have to do it right way. And we look at that, and every single time we raise our voice, we get more upset. He'll look at us, and this is what we do. He knows, if we get speaking, he's saying this. You yell at me, then we want to have to listen to you. Because every single time we get upset at him, he yells back, and he just does it even more, and then he just runs away. And there are times when he doesn't even look at us when we're talking to him. And Matthias, we're speaking to you. I don't know who taught him that. I didn't think, But it's when we speak love and truth and we say, Matthias, we love you. You're so good at this. You can do this. You're our son. There's nothing that you can do that fails. There are all these things that you'll actually sit there and you still won't color. You still won't color. But you'll sit there and listen. One of the most fundamental things for children to develop and grow is this need for love and recognition. It is the same thing that our churches. For our churches to be a healthy church, one of the most fundamental things that we need in our churches is for people to be able to say, I love you, I thank you, I recognize the work that you're doing, and I appreciate what you're doing. More churches in the United States spend more time figuring out what's wrong with people rather than what's good about them. More energy, more effort is spent people picking out what's wrong with the other people sitting next to them rather than picking out what's good about them. And you know what this phenomenon I'm going to call it the drama syndrome. It is not a scientific term, but it is a term that I conclude to be totally factual. It is the drama syndrome, and in particular, it is the Korean drama syndrome, because every Korean drama is about a problem about somebody. You never see a drama about something good. Okay? And now think about it. If you were reading a description about two dramas, one is about this child who has, who's fallen in love with his sister that he doesn't know is his sister. Okay? And another one is about a happy family that just go about loving each other. Which one would you choose to watch? Most people would choose to watch the one that is a sister who doesn't know is a sister. Because why? It's more interesting. Because it's more interesting to find out what's wrong with people than about what's good about people. And the thing is, in our churches, and not just this, I'm not talking about one church, I'm talking about the churches in general. The reason why churches split so often and people get hurt is because more people are spending time what's wrong with the other people that are sitting next to them than thinking about what's good about them. And how do I know this? It's so much easier for me to write the things that are wrong about my friends than the things that I think are good about my friends. When somebody asks me, what's wrong about this guy? I can think, oh yeah, here. It's like, what's 3 things that you think is good that you do in life? Really? But just as it is foundational for children, it is foundational for the family and the church. If a church is going to be healthy, you need to understand that showing appreciation, saying, good job, thank you. I recognize what you're doing. I love the way that you serve. Doing the things that people don't recognize. People pick up stuff and they say, no, thank you for doing that. Thank you for setting up fellowship. Thank you for being so loving. Thank you for being just being able to do that is foundation is important for their life. It's good for the church. Secondly, it's good for our children and our families. It's good for our children and our families. Because you know what? The way that we treat one another and the health that we treat one another with, it influences the people that watch and talk about us. Let me share a story with you. I'm a pastor's kid. I'm also a missionary kid. Okay, so in short, we say these things called PKs and MKs. Right? And the running joke always is that MKs are always better than PKs. So, when you find another pastor's kid and I'm a missionary's kid, I look at this pastor's kid and I'm like, dude, I feel bad for you because I am just superior to you in all ways. And the reason why we say this is that you find so many pastor's kids that struggle so often because why? They just grow up with so much more pressure. Right? All these people, they know that you're the pastor's kids, and so you have to grow up properly. You can never rebel in any single way. So I have friends of mine who have never had, things like they've never been able to color their hair, right? Never been able to have long kind of hair, or never been able to have the earring as growing up as a teenager. None of this stuff. Because why? The only reason is that they're the pastor's kid. Okay? They're the pastor's kid. This one pastor's kid, he is a good friend of mine, but he's very far removed from the church. Very far removed from the church, almost to the point where he's like, I don't think I'm ever going to be, a believer. And recently I had a chance to catch up with this guy, and I was wanting to talk to him because I was like, maybe it's because of all the pressure that other people put on his life that he was hurt and jaded, and that's why he doesn't want to come. But it's none of that. You know what he says? The reason why I don't want to go to church is because when I was in Sunday school, really young, all I heard my parents talk about was complaining about the congregation. That's all I heard growing up. About how this Sunday was always giving them a heartache. How this one Sunday was always doing these things that they didn't like. How this Sunday was always saying one thing but doing another. All you heard growing up was their parents complaining. You know what? That's just one case. I know so many people kids, even in our youth group who grow up, all they hear from their parents is what they don't like about the church. What they don't like about certain people, what they don't like about certain pastors, what they don't like about certain other people in the church. And guess what, brothers and sisters? It cultivates within them. And so what happens? They start developing this attitude of negativity. And it's not anymore about praising and saying thank you and about saying, God, thank you for the things that you've blessed us. It's all about what's wrong, and what's bad, and what's bad. And we find these people who grow up who never come back to the church. Why? Because every single time they go into the church, all they see is what's wrong with the church. They never see what's good about it. All they see is what's wrong with it. When they meet new people, instead of seeing what's the strength, all they see is what's their weakness. And we wonder, these parents will come up to me and they say, I don't know why my kid is like this. I don't know how it happened to this kid. And I try to tell them it's because of the way that they grow up. It's from what they see in the people. It's good for our children because it's in their attitude that they will learn what it means to serve. And for those of us that don't have kids, I think about this, I'm like, maybe does this only apply for people who have children? No, because as we grow, and as you young adults grow, and you start thinking about getting married and having kids, this is also very important. That what we leave behind to our children isn't the big things, it's the things that are our attitude, the way that we carry ourselves, the way that we show gratitude, the way that we say thank you. It transforms lives to grow. It's good for the church, it's good for our children, and lastly, it's good for us. How is it good for us when we do things? We are almost entering the last 2 weeks of the season of Lent. And what is Lent? Lent is about thinking about what Jesus is. And essentially what Lent is the time when we give thanks for our entire formulation, what Jesus did for you and me so that we don't have to go through what Jesus did. How is giving thanks to other people good for us? Because it reminds us about the nature of Jesus. It teaches us the heart of God. It teaches us to be able to recognize what other people are doing and that they do it for us. It gives us a heart of gratitude and thankfulness. When Paul is writing this letter and he says to this people, the people in Philippians, he says, thank Timothy, thank Christ. He's saying, guys, this showing appreciation is something that must happen in the church. Because it's a healthy church, it's a healthy family, it's a healthy church. It's not just the right thing to do, it's not just a it's a command. See, notice ever that during the season of Lent or Thanksgiving, whatever we give thanks to God, it's the same thing. There's a reason why the greatest commandment, the two greatest commandments, love the Lord with your love and all your heart and love your neighbor as your first. God says, as you give thanks to God, you give thanks to God. As you love God, you love God. As you serve God, you serve God. As you appreciate and honor God, you appreciate and honor others. It is a commandment and a necessary element of life to be a healthy church, a healthy family, a healthy individual. And so as we close, I want us to do something. And I know this may sound a little bit weird, but I want you to do this. Just pair up with the person sitting next to you. It's kind of nice because we're all sitting in pairs. So pair up with the person sitting next to you. Just pair up. And for the next minute or two, I want you to think about two things that you are thankful about that person. Two things that you are thankful about that person. And in the next minute or so, you just share that with each other. And you say, I'm thankful about these two things. I appreciate these two things that you do. And let's just really love on each other. Can we do that? So as we close, let's do that. So just take 2 minutes. Just think about two things that you can think of that you love about them, that you appreciate about them. Then share it, and then switch, and then we'll close. Okay, let's do that. our church would be marked, so that when people come, they would know that our church is different because we appreciate it. Thanks. Not because it's the right etiquette, because we follow the rules. It's the foundation that it needs to be a healthy church. Father, we thank you so much for this morning.